Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking with Mike Benitez. He is a retiring active duty officer with over 25 years of service in the U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Air Force. He has served in various operational training and staff positions and has held fellowships in the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, Congress, and Silicon Valley. He's also the founder of The Merge, a defense newsletter, which I recommend that everybody check out. You get it every single Sunday, and I read it with coffee in the morning. Mike, it's good to have you back on the show.
Hey, Aaron, I'm glad to be here.
Well, the reason I wanted to have you on is because, this podcast has been paying obvious extra close attention to the war in Ukraine. And as the war has progressed, or at least maybe the lack of progress on the Russian side, there's been growing calls in the United States, I think as well as in Europe, but primarily in the US, to implement some sort of no-fly zone, either over all of Ukraine or over parts of Ukraine. I think this term gets thrown around a lot. And you and Mike Pietrucha just wrote or republished an updated version of an article you wrote for War on the Rocks called The Dangerous Allure of the No-Fly Zone. So perhaps you could just talk a little bit about what a no-fly zone actually is and why you wrote the article in the first place.
Yeah, so what it is and what it isn't. A no-fly zone, it's not a half measure like limited airstrikes or limited intervention. It is a full military commitment that will put forces in direct action against an opposing force. So in the case of Ukraine, it would put NATO or U.S. Resources and military personnel in direct conflict with Russian forces, which is escalation into an area that the United States and NATO right now does not want to get into.
I mean, for me, this is obvious, but it seems like this has been like the thread that everybody pulls on. like I'm just curious, like where you think that this idea comes from, perhaps how it's been misconstrued about what it actually is that it entails in terms of the overall commitment. Like, could you talk a little bit about like what actually would happen if you wanted to enforce a no-fly zone besides just like shooting down Russians or at least suppressing air defenses so that you can guarantee overflight in certain places?
Yeah, and actually, it's very helpful to go back. And I saw a poll today, and I forgot who had released it. I saw it on Twitter, and it was a for or against, or I don't know, kind of poll for instituting a no-fly zone. And they broke it down by age category, and it turned out the older demographic, so the 55 and older, had a higher propensity to say yes to the no-fly zone, where everyone that was younger than that had a drastically different response. And so when you break it down by the demographic and you rewind time, that's where the problem comes in. And so all of these people who grew up in the 90s, the early 90s specifically, and lived through their adult years during that time frame will remember not just Desert Storm, but what happened immediately after Desert Storm. And so your sidecar into history. So after Desert Storm, when the Iraqi forces went back into Iraq from Kuwait, there was an issue in the north where the coalition forces were worried about protecting the Kurds from Iraqi attack. And so that immediately launched Operation Provide Comfort in 1991. And that instituted essentially a no-fly zone to protect the Kurds from air attack. In 1997, they renamed that to Operation Northern Watch, and that expanded no fly to also make it no radiate. So we would take out surface-to-air missile systems and aircraft that were operating in that no-fly zone in the northern Iraq. And I tell you that to tell you that also happened in the South. So in 1992, Southern Watch began, which was another no-fly zone. And in 1996, we expanded that to make it a no-drive zone. So the Iraqi military was restricted from even driving into that geographic region. And the big takeaway from the Iraq no-fly zone history is that it was immediately after we were in direct conflict with the same force that we were enforcing the no-fly zone against, and we had decimated their military, and there was no threat of escalation because it was immediately post-conflict with the same exact military that we had just fought. Okay, now I tell you that story to tell you what happened almost exactly the same time, and this is where the no-fly zone started picking up steam, is in Bosnia. Said, well, if it works in Iraq, it's going to work in Bosnia. And so in 1993 was Operation Deny Flight. I don't know if you remember this one. This is probably okay. Good.
The
Yeah, a lot of
listeners
people.
should.
Yeah, I hope so. So the whole purpose of that was to prevent fixed wing aircraft from flying into Bosnia from nearby Croatia and Serbia. So it was a deterrent. Realize that the dynamics of that is the aircraft were flying directly over friendly territory they controlled, and it was only to prevent fixed wing aircraft from crossing the border. Well, here's what actually happened. If you read the history books, so that worked for about a little bit. It did deter some flights, but in February of 1994, 6 Serbian fighters actually crossed into Bosnia and bombed a factory. And as a result, U.S. Air Force F-16 shot down, I think, 4 of the 6 jets, and I think the 5th one crashed on the way back. Again, there is no surface-to-air missile systems, and there's no man-portable air defenses. There's no artillery because they're flying directly over land that they control. Interestingly, they had a really hard time trying to enforce that with helicopters based on the way that they were moving around and the markings that they had on them. So that was in February. And so then escalation immediately occurred. And so a little bit later, the Air Force actually attacked Serbian command posts and tanks. So now there's some escalation. And then the month after that is probably the most famous thing that everyone remembers, is when Scott O'Grady got shot down. So he got shot down doing a routine combat air patrol, just flying around enforcing the no-fly zone. And he was shot down by a surface-to-air missile. And then the next month, or a couple months later, we actually lost an MQ-1, was shot down by enemy fire as well. Well, then that escalated into what became Operation Deliberate Force, which was 1 month of high-intensity retaliatory strikes. And the big takeaway from Bosnia, after I tell you all that, is that it started as a no-fly zone over land that we controlled, friendly territory, and it escalated into direct conflict. And so that's kind of the history of the 2 no-fly zone lessons. I think everyone wants to remember what happened in Iraq because we did it for a very, very long time, but they don't remember the circumstances of how we're able to do that. And the dynamics are completely different. And then we talked a little bit in our article about Kosovo, where, what happens if you try to at least maintain control of the air over something that's a little bit harder. So someone even tries to fight back. And that's what happened in Kosovo in '99. And so that really gets into the heart of, how do you enforce a no-fly zone? Is you need air supremacy, not just air superiority. Huge difference.
Can you explain that? Because I think that also gets lost in the Department of Defense briefings every day about like the Russian status over Ukraine, this idea between superiority and supremacy.
Yeah, so Western doctrine really defines it as degrees of control of the air. And so right now what you see happening is we have parity. So there's 3 basic controls. So parity is no one has an advantage and they're basically fighting it. So this is active conflict. When one side gains the advantage over the other to a point where the losing or the weaker side cannot effectively interfere with operations from the side with the advantage, that is the definition of air superiority. So that doesn't mean that, if one aircraft gets shot down, that doesn't mean that we've lost air superiority. It just means that if we can continue the mission, then we continue the mission, and losses will happen. The difference is now when we get to air supremacy, that is prohibitive interference. So the difference being like I'm sorry, I said that backwards. supremacy being prohibitive and superiority being effective. So the big takeaway is supremacy is you have, flying around like Afghanistan for 10 or 20 years and no one is even shooting at you, versus air superiority, you can take losses and you continue to maintain your advantage. Yeah, the difference is if you try to enforce a no-fly zone with air superiority and not air supremacy, if your risk of escalation and retaliation or retaliatory strikes is extreme, because if you lose an aircraft, in this case, let's say a NATO aircraft was shot down over Ukrainian airspace, how does that play out? Like, well, where's the pilot go? How are we going to get the pilot? What if the pilot gets captured by the Russians? And so you can see how this extremely sensitive issue starts getting extremely complex extremely quickly. That kind of makes sense.
It does. It does. And I Kosovo always kind of sticks out to me, because they fought back, right? And like the fight back angle, I think, is often lost because it ended up, I think, after 78 days, if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head,
That sounds right.
It was one of, I think, sort of, precursors to at least, adversaries or the states where a no-fly zone is being imposed, looking around and saying, well, we're not going to acquiesce to that in the ways that the Iraqis did, or the ways that at least took place in Bosnia a couple of years previously.
Yeah, and I'd say that again, if you go back and look at the history of Kosovo, it is very insightful of the power of someone even using some kind of shoot and scoot or guerrilla non-traditional tactics to deny you air supremacy. So Kosovo, that the size of the war, the air war over Kosovo, was about the size of Connecticut, and there were less than 50 known systems in the size of Connecticut. And number one, we couldn't find and kill them all. Number two, the average equipment that they were using to deny the air supremacy or air superiority was about 30 years old. So this is not new technology, even back in the 90s. So it was all 1960s, 1970s tech. But when you actually look over the course of about 78 days, I think is what you mentioned, the U.S. shot almost 750 anti-radiation missiles at those 44 surface-to-air missile systems to try to knock them out. And those missiles, again, 750 radar homing missiles, what are they homing onto? They're homing onto the surface-to-air missile systems, which are manned by people of the adversary forces. So I don't think people generally make the connection of what you're talking about when you try to enforce that. No, by the way, we famously lost an F-117 and an F-16 in the course of that scuffle, and there was a whole bunch of other resources and weapons expended to try to gain and maintain air supremacy, but we never could. And the reason why you can go back in history and say that we never actually gained air supremacy is our command and control, our tankers, and our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms. They all had to stand off outside of the AOR. They had to stand off into the over by the ocean off the coast, so they wouldn't be impacted, because we couldn't guarantee their safety.
Yeah, they couldn't get into the potential range of surface-to-air missiles.
Exactly. And that became, again, if you go back and read history, even in the late 90s, this is when we realized that the J-Stars was not going to be something that we wanted to have. So we realized this 20 years ago, because Kosovo is not flat. It has a lot of ridges and rolling terrain, and most of the lines of communications are built in valleys. And so when you have to stand off your radar system that's looking at the ground, it creates a lot of shadowing, and all that shadowing where the radar can't see happens to be where all of the roads are, which are all the vehicles that it's trying to find. Right. So it was a very simple lesson in geography and math that we knew 20 years ago that was going to be a problem. But back to the point, that's the difference. We never actually were able to gain or maintain air supremacy.
Again, I think that's an important point, because as we look at the no-fly zone, a lot of people are suggesting that you can simply declare one. in that you use the threat of US action to deter an adversary from either flying or flying across like maybe a demarcated place in a country. And I think the closest analogy we have to this is Syria. I know you're pretty familiar with Syria and
Yep.
flying over Iraq and stuff like that. Yeah, I think the Kosovo example is actually more important, for this again, because they chose not to just take it; they chose to fight back, and so it really is up to the adversary for how they want to react here. And maybe you could talk a little bit about Syria and about maybe why that differed from a no-fly zone, particularly because there were Russians there. But maybe you want to pick up from there.
Yeah. Well, number one, there was constant State Department coordination because we weren't, it was a proxy conflict, right? We're not in direct conflict with them to begin with. And so the quote no fly zone that we weren't really enforcing, it was more a diplomatically segregated airspace and deconflicted. And so we used diplomatic channels to make sure that there was not going to be an issue of force on force between Russia and the coalition, because even though Russia is supporting Syrian forces and we're supporting the OPFOR, and we're trying to go after ISIS. We have competing interests over the same geographic region, so there's a lot of entangled terrain and entangled interests, and so there's a lot of diplomatic channels to make sure that did not escalate. There's some interesting stories about aircraft being very, very, very close and on top of each other in threatening ways, but nothing ended up escalating. But if you take the Kosovo example of what happens when a force wants to fight back, and there are Russian forces in Ukraine right now, obviously that's why we're talking. Look at the geographic problem. So we talked about Kosovo is about the size of Connecticut. Ukraine, I don't think people realize this. Ukraine is 50 times larger. So the geographic problem is enormous. It is not a small country.
It's the largest country in Europe, I think. It's huge.
It's huge. So even and it gets worse. So let's talk about geography. So it's 50 times larger. And even if these the so-called humanitarian zones or areas, even if we're just talking about that, just those areas are 10 times larger than the area that we had to deal with in Kosovo. Oh, by the way, it's directly over Russian forces, which have obviously ways that they can threaten aircraft and take down an aircraft. And then you keep pulling the thread on geographic problem. The airfields, because the way that Eastern Europe looks from, guess what, the Cold War, most of the more built up airfields are not along the eastern borders of our Eastern European countries. The closest airfields that we have U.S. forces staged right now in Poland and in Romania are 200 miles just from the border of Ukraine, not to the place that they're actually going to go. So when you look at like Kyiv, which is, it is in the northern part, north central Ukraine, that is a long way away from a U.S. airbase, or not a U.S., but a NATO airbase. And it's a really long way from even where a tanker track would have to be. And oh, by the way, now you look at the next problem, which is threat to forces. So we have tankers in the air, command and control to span that distance. We put fighters all the way over there. Even if we did all of that, all of those things that I just told you that are in the air are directly in SA-21 WESs. So they have SA-21 surface-to-air missile systems in Kaliningrad. Oh, by the way, these are 200-mile range missile systems.
That's the S-400 for
yeah, sorry. NATO reporting name SA-21, the S-400. So they have them in Kaliningrad. A month before the invasion, Russia sent 2 S-400 battalions to Belarus. And that's, one battalion is about 8, if I remember right, 8 missile systems. So they're up to 16 SA-21 systems in Belarus, which, oh, by the way, is right next to Kyiv. So if you think that, if you're going to put an F-35 in that dense of a airspace, that contested airspace, and hope that someone doesn't pull a trigger, that's again the threat of escalation. And then, oh, by the way, say something happens, one of our aircraft goes down. Depending on the aircraft, now you're looking at, okay, now we have to recover the remains of the aircraft or destroy the aircraft. Reference the F-35s going into the ocean recently, and
Yep.
so
It took a bath.
yeah, it took a bath. So there's all these other things that really make it complicated. And then if we commit a manned person, a manned aircraft, put a person in aircraft, then we have to have a plan to recover that person, which means now I have a combat search and rescue force that I have to build a plan for. So you can see like the tooth to tail for something like this is really, really complex. And that's a lot of resources just to put, one fighter for a couple hours over this airspace. And a no fly zone means it is a 24-hour a day coverage.
Right.
And because it's so far away and the way the dynamics on the ground are, we're not putting missile systems on the ground to shoot down Russian aircraft. We're putting we're talking about hypothetically putting coalition forces directly over Russian forces and basically saying, please don't shoot us. And the dynamics are so lopsided. So if something like that would have even happened, being able to find out where the point of origin was and confirming, hostile intent, hostile act, and all the things that go into like legalities of war and Counter-Strike, we're on the wrong side of the equation for that. And at the end of the day, the military utility of all of those things would still be questionable, because what military advantage would it have? Because most of the attack that's going on right now is actually not even coming from the air. It's coming from indirect fire from artillery and rockets, not sorties from fighters. Now, there have been some fighters that have been shot down, but by and large, that is artillery that's being wheeled in these convoys. And unless I missed it, the first day of the invasion was the only day that they even committed any bombers.
It's possible. I just think that the overall logistical tail is just incredible, one, and then two, it depends on acquiescence of Russians to allow Americans to overfly them as they're fighting an invasion. Whatever you think of the invasion, I wouldn't want anybody flying over me. And so, it is just a recipe for escalation.
Yeah, and all it takes is one soldier, one Russian soldier, that didn't have his coffee and had an itchy trigger finger, and then the entire situation escalates potentially beyond containment. And now you get into retaliation and all those other things that go with it. Yeah. So the other thing I want to say is, when we talk about the quote humanitarian corridors and things that have been kind of, let's just rename it, call it that. The whole point of the diplomacy to have the ceasefire negotiations to come to that agreement, all war, and I wrote about this in the Merge last week, all war starts because there's a failure of diplomacy, and all war inevitably ends because there is a success of diplomacy. And so when you come to a diplomatic compromise to have a ceasefire, diplomacy is the best way to do it, to enforce that. So if whoever breaks the ceasefire, the diplomacy has failed. But all of the, on the IO side, the information operations and the global power of how hard power and soft power work together to influence those instruments of power, it is all about let the diplomacy work. We try to enforce that through military on top of diplomacy, in this case, it is a high risk of miscalculation and escalation.
So let me ask you two final questions, then we'll wrap up here. It's just one is, if the airspace is going to be forever contested because of the size of the task at hand in terms of finding these mobile surface-to-air missile sites, historic problems on the Russian side from being able to do this mission well. And I think what we've talked about is that this mission is inherently hard, right? So, and if you're not, and they don't do it well. So it's hard and they don't really do it well. Three, will they ever basically be able to have to achieve air superiority in this conflict? And if they can't, is there really even an advantage to Western fighters going in over the top of, say, Ukrainian air defenses and all of the challenges imposed of having two non-allied militaries, that being the Ukrainians and, say, NATO, and then all of the intra challenges within NATO, of operating inside of Ukrainian surface to air missiles that I think at the outset of the war was responsible for some friendly fire, which is not all that uncommon in highly sort of contested, very fast moving conflict environments.
Yeah, exactly. There was definitely some frats early on, fratricides, because of the fog and frictional war, as you said, and the dynamic. In this case, where we have Russians that are moving in, and we can see kind of where they're going. We track the best we can, but they're going through into a country that we don't have maybe the best coalition intelligence sharing relationship. So we don't actually know where their stuff is, and it's all Russian based.
Right.
Because they're an Eastern Bloc country. So, from us, from space, for instance, a Russian vehicle looks like a Russian vehicle looks like a Russian vehicle, even if it's Ukrainian. And so the mingled forces, obviously there's some geometry you can figure out, hey, that one's shooting north, that one's shooting south, and where they're coming from. But the point is that you commingle those forces that look a lot alike, and then you compound that, if you based on what you just said, you bring in something that's non-compatible, it doesn't integrate. So we have a Western type equipment, so whether it's weapons or everything from just like laser codes and how the weapons work, to data links, to communication, encrypted communication, which is becoming an interesting thing that's kind of unfolding right now. All those things that we don't have interoperability, and this is why we stress the value of not just like foreign material sales, but making sure that we have and sell stuff to our partners and allies that will have interoperability. Because if we say that the strategic long-term power of the United States is in its ability to create these big coalitions, then they have to work together. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. In this case, because they don't share any of the same equipment, they don't share any of the same doctrine, training, which again goes into what is the predictability of maneuver and what's going to happen. We actually don't know. Now, that being said, compounding that, the Ukrainians are being very, very resourceful, and so it's hats off to them how they're fighting. They're fighting for their country. So yeah, I'm really, my heart's with them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think people want to do something. The no-fly zone just comes to people's minds. The final question here is, there's been a lot of talk about the transfer of, I guess, they really are Soviet era, I believe, originally GDR, now Polish, now on the way to being phased out, MiG-29s to Ukraine. Now, I don't think this will actually happen, but this has sort of become another symbol of American or Western commitment to the Ukrainians. Do you have any thoughts on this? I think the idea is a little bit silly, precisely because I think what the Ukrainians need is road mobile surface-to-air missiles to forever contest Russian air operations, particularly in the western part of the country, and to attrite the VKS in ways that operate on the right side of the attrition curve if you're Ukrainian, versus the wrong side of the attrition curve if you're the VKS. I don't think MiG-29s will really help, but maybe I'm wrong. What do you think? What are the thoughts on this? Because I'm certain this will be a continued controversial issue in American domestic politics.
Yeah, so it is a very, very complex topic that's, again, very, very poorly understood, just like no-fly zones. So your wave top 30 seconds is that, yes, they have interoperability because they're the same aircraft. They've been in the hands of separate countries for 20, 30 years. So who knows if the avionics is the same, probably the same engines and flight controls and basic stuff. And you're looking at shooting, Russian based rockets, Russian missiles off of these MiG-29s, which are, Russian built, back in the day. So the interoperability is probably decent, but for what they're going to use it for. But back to the point, like what you said, just because they get another couple MiG-29s, is that going to change the calculus of the war? I'd say no, because it's, when you look at how the Russian scheme of maneuver has been, there is a ton of questions going on right now of, what Russian force is this? Because they're not doing a lot of the things that all of intelligence assessments said they would, and all these the glossy brochure of the 10-foot tall boogeyman where is the combined arms maneuver? Where is the REC, which is their electronic warfare doctrine? They're using Garmin GPSs in their military vehicles and unencrypted radios to communicate. Like, where is the sophistication of all of their military equipment? Where's the experience of the soldiers? There's 18-year-old conscripts that are being pushed forward so your will to fight and how that actually works. So it's really interesting to see, like, this. Part of me thinks that this is not the real Russian military, and the other part of me thinks, well, if it is, then there's something else going on that everyone has been missing the past 20 years and what's going on in Russia. So I don't think the MiG-29 is gonna help. And back to your point, even if they have a surface to air missile system, say they magically got their own S-400 flown in from somewhere, again, the most of the threats are not from the air, it's from the ground. So those Russian forces just walk up and shoot the radar operator in the head. That missile system isn't too useful because there's not a whole lot of attack from the air. Where if they had aircraft, they can do air to ground attacks, which is what I think that's where a lot of the damage was coming on early from their Air Force. Obviously they took a lot of losses too, but they inflicted quite a bit of damage.
Final thought, and then I'll let you go, is there's been a lot of talk about sort of the lack of Russian air operations, at least from what we can see in the open source. I think there's a lot of head scratching going on because they're not fighting like we expected Russians to fight. I think the most obvious explanation is that they weren't prepared because of the challenges inherent in an authoritarian regime that had really weak assumptions going into a conflict. But what is your assessment of the VKS? Just I guess a weekend or a little more than a weekend. It's raising a lot of questions, and perhaps you can talk about those questions as we wrap up here.
Yeah, I don't want to speculate too much. It's too early to tell. I think the study and the after actions, as we go back and we look at the intelligence and go kind of put the story back together of what happened and when. I think that'll be really, really interesting, and I hope it'll be released to the public at some point about what actually happened, whether it's a logistics failure, even though they spent the better part of 10 months building a force along the border to invade, which doesn't seem that would be a logistics failure. But I mean, we saw that 2 days into the war, there was already fuel and food shortages. Whether it's a combined arms maneuver, just a failure to execute, whether it's a failure of committing the right forces. So they figured we'll just overwhelm Ukraine with quantity, and we'll keep our quality forces in reserve just so we don't have to risk them at all. But that being said, now I did see some reports about some of the fighter pilots that got shot down from Russia were actually some of their more famous ones, not just an 18-year-old in a fighter jet. So, but we'll see what happens. It's very, very interesting to see, especially the next week. Something is going to have to change. Whether logistics is going to cripple and the Russians, the stalemate to Kyiv is going to retreat, or there's going to be a phase 2 where there's going to be a lot of reinforcements with a lot of logistics to push through. And then we get into urban warfare and a whole bunch of things, and it's going to get really ugly for the Russians. And I wish the Ukrainians the best.
Well, with that, Mike, thanks for coming on. I want to reiterate the standard disclaimer, because I think, as you said in the answer, you are a retiring active duty officer, so you're still in the military. So the views expressed are those of us on the show and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of the Department of the Air Force or the U.S. government or the Department of Defense. Did I get that right, Mike?
Yep, that works.
Perfect.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
With that, Mike, thanks for coming on the show. I encourage everybody to read the article on War on the Rocks called The Dangerous Allure of the No-Fly Zone, and check out the Merge newsletter. So with that, thanks for everybody for listening.
Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more from the Foreign Policy Research Institute's research, podcasts, and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.